NYU. Um, Again, hello everyone. My name is Ali Mirsapasi. I am a faculty member here at NYU. And on behalf of myself and all my colleagues at Kevorkian Center and Iranian Studies Initiative at NYU, I would like to warmly welcome you to our second event of the spring semester. As you all know, we are gathering here virtually during a deeply troubling and stressful time as war and aggression continue to unfold in Iran. Many Iranians have become victims of American and Israeli aggression. Our thoughts and hearts are with all people of Iran, and we sincerely hope that this war will come to an end very soon. Before I start introducing our panel and panelists, let me just remind you of the two forthcoming events that we have planned for this semester. On Friday, April the 10th, during the lunchtime at 12:30, we have Professor Farzin Vejdani of Toronto Metropolitan University, who will speak, and he will be in conversation with our colleague here at NYU, Sarah Persley, and the topic of discussion is Professor Vejdani's work on private sin, public crimes, policing, punishment, and authority in Iran. So this would be an in-person event at lunchtime, and food will be presented, will be offered. But again, I want to emphasize that this would be an in-person event. Our fourth and last events of this semester will also be an in-person events on April 30th, which is a Thursday at 5 p.m. We have Professor Zohre Soltani, Assistant Professor of Art History at NYU here, New York University, who will speak on From Prison to Garden Museum, Architecture, Trauma, and the Politics of Memory in Tehran. I hope we can see you all in these two forthcoming events. Okay, now let's move to our wonderful panel that we have organized for you. But as an introduction to this panel, I would like to ask our colleague, Dr. Azam Khatam of York University and editor of Global Iranian Studies, to briefly speak about the special issue of Global Iranian Studies that was devoted to the topic of today's panel. And after Azam is done, I will introduce the panelists. The floor is yours, Azam John. Can you go ahead and briefly introduce the Global Iranian Studies issue?
Thank you, Alijan. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this panel on migration and Iranian diaspora. I'm especially grateful to the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies for hosting this panel and for creating a space where independent journals like us can present their work and engage in critical conversation with their audience. Global Iranian Studies Review is a bilingual journal It's a book review journal, thematic one, which dedicated to new social science scholarship on Iran, which is published in and outside the country. It is a thematic journal in the term that each issue takes up a pressing question out of the existing social science literature. And across our 5 issues so far, we have explored topics such as Iranian Revolution, academic freedom in Iran, women and transformative politics, migration and Iranian diaspora, and our last issue was Persian Gulf studies. Each issue includes a section on books which have been published in Persian, typically 4 to 5 titles. The section on global Iranian studies review focus on the works which has been published in other languages. We also do interview with authors, write introductions to recent PhD dissertations, and highlight the research centers which are working in the specific field of study. Through this structure, we aim to bridge scholarly analysis published and produced inside the country with outside, and we try to actually focus on the debates and non-existing exchanges which we try to promote and create a space for. Today's panel connects closely to Globus Review 4th issue on migration and Iranian diaspora. In this issue, we also try to understand how the studies inside the country, which is focused on the migration, could talk about the diasporic experiences. These 2 separate studies actually focus on the subject before the migration and after that. But how they can communicate with each other and how they can help to answer the question raised in both sides is a challenging question. We try to just shed light on the major debates inside the country about the migration and main debates which has been studied, examined, and developed through the literature outside the country. Our special issue advisors, which every issue has its own. In this topic was Professor Emi Malak and Professor Amin Moghadam. I would like to thank them here because without their contribution to the issue, their guidance and their support in every stage of production of this issue, this was not possible for us to get that focus and develop the ideas that we have done. I also want to thank Professor Mirsapasi because he is patient with us. Every panel that this journal has done with has been hosted here at Kevorkian Center actually needs a lot of coordination, and I am really thankful for his dedicated work, his patience with us in organizing this collaboration. I believe that this discussion today will continue the spirit of dialogue and exchange that we hope to foster in the journal. So the last thing that I would like to add is that I invite you to subscribe to Globus Review because it helps us to sustain our work, and you can follow our work as it grows. You have the journal's website in the flyer. I also share it in the chat with you. And thank you again for being here.
Many thanks. And I too encourage everyone who hear us to go on the web and check out the journal and hopefully subscribe to it. Many thanks again, Dr. Khatam. Now, let me introduce our 3 panelists, and then have them speak. And I need to also say that for those of you in the audience who have questions, please write your questions in the chat room. We will have time at the end where each panelist would respond to your questions. Of course, you don't have to ask questions. If you have comments, you can also share them in the chat room. Excuse me. Our first speaker, panelist, is Professor Amy Malek, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and American Studies at William and Mary. Dr. Malik will speak about her book titled Culture Beyond Country, Strategies of Inclusion in Global Iranian Diaspora. The book examines how diasporic Iranians respond to persistent misrepresentations and marginalizations by turning to culture as a deliberate strategy of inclusion. Our second speaker is Professor Amin Muqaddam, who is the junior professor and chair of migration and inequalities at the University of Poitiers in France. His research examines the intersection between home ownership practices, migration, and diaspora politics in Toronto and Istanbul. Our third and last speaker is Dr. Omid Asayesh, a postdoctoral researcher at University of Calgary in Canada. He will present his research on involuntary immobility in Iran. His work explores how widespread migration aspirations, combined with limited opportunities for mobility, shape the lives of many Iranians, including those who stay in the country, those who live under unprepared conditions, and those who return and face the social stigma often linked to perceived failure. I would ask each of our panelists to try to limit their presentations to about 20 minutes. And as I said again, after our panelists make their presentations, there will be time for questions and answers and comments from the audience. I would now ask our first speaker, Amy John, please start your presentation, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mirsapasi, for that warm introduction. Thank you, Dr. Khatam, for all your leadership in making this issue possible and for inviting Amin and I to be involved and to think together with you about these questions of Iranian diaspora studies and migration studies. I'm also grateful to NYU. I am an alum of the Kevorkian Center, so it's very nice to be back virtually, but to nevertheless be within the sphere of this university. So before I begin, I just want to state really plainly what we already know, that Iranians, wherever we are in the world, are living in a time of war and displacement again. And for many, if not most of us who study Iran and its diaspora, our work is, nor never has been, some kind of dispassionate scholarly endeavor that's really easily separable from our personal lives and commitments and values. And I kind of doubt any scholar's work is actually dispassionate, but we'll leave that aside. But the last weeks and months and years indeed have been particularly challenging for our loved ones in Iran and also, therefore, in its diaspora. I know I've struggled to find my footing in the last couple of weeks, especially And it's uh, I think, natural reaction to feel like sometimes our work is meaningless in these kinds of moments. But I have been reminded by dear colleagues who have been working tirelessly in these last few weeks to kind of be engaged, that it's precisely in these moments that reshaping that, these wars are reshaping the lives of millions of Iranians and displacing millions of Iranians. And so it's also really urgent that we recenter Iranian life and livelihood beyond the states that seem really determined somehow to diminish them. So it's in that spirit that I join you all today. And for an event that we planned many months ago, indeed. So here we seek to highlight recent scholarship on Iranian migration and in the Iranian diaspora that was kind of brought together in this issue of Globus Review, particularly to make legible this field of Iranian migration studies and Iranian diaspora studies that has existed, but somehow maybe has been missed by a lot of scholars who are suddenly now thinking about the diaspora in new ways and bringing their analytical attention and scholarly rigor to think about the diaspora for the first time. So in my remarks today, I've been tasked with offering a brief history of the field of Iranian diaspora studies, something that I've been committed to for a couple decades now. And I'll do that by drawing really extensively, actually, from a conversation that's in the special issue with Dr. Persis Karim, who many of us know as one of the founders of this field and has been a mentor to many of us who have followed in her footsteps. So this is the journal. I don't know if we've actually seen the physical. It's very, thick and rich, and I hope that you will see the website. It's also open source, which is kind of the whole point, right? We want to make legible and make accessible the work that's being done by so many of our colleagues in the field. I'll also offer a brief introduction of my book, but honestly, the main focus is this field of study and the kind of research and scholarship we seek to highlight here. So allow me to kind of rewind in our minds back to the mid-2000s. This was a time when the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan were underway. Ahmadinejad had recently been elected. We'd not yet experienced the Green Movement. The smartest phone still had to be flipped open and closed. And there was certainly no such thing as Iran International. I began graduate school in that period and began doing ethnographic fieldwork in the Iranian diaspora not long after that. And so when I started doing that, I would attend, in the spirit of ethnographic fieldwork, where you go to every event you can and seek to meet as many people as you can. I was going to these dinners, to these conferences, parades, festivals, and would kind of introduce myself. And it became a very familiar exchange where I would say, I'm really interested in the Iranian diaspora. And the question I would often get back in English or Persian was, what is a diaspora? Right? It's the kind of language was a little bit unfamiliar still in the mid-2000s. And then the follow-up would be like, am I in the diaspora? And then if I, tried to explain it a little bit more closely, that it maybe not. So, well, how could I be involved in, how could I be called something that I don't even know this word? Like, how could you include me in a category that I've never heard of? Fast forward 20 years, and that question is no longer on our minds, right? When we talk about the Iranian diaspora today, whether in the Americas, in Europe, in Asia, in Iran, in Persian, we no longer need to come up with a quick and clunky definition of what it is and whether we are part of it or not. It's really kind of generally agreed by now. There's something to be called the Iranian diaspora. We might have different opinions about it, but it's no longer a question. Is there such a thing? But how we think about it, how we understand it, how to study it is kind of as diverse as the people that word seeks to encompass. And Iranian diaspora studies, as a result, is also a relatively young field. It didn't begin as, I would argue, a kind of clearly defined area of research with a clearly defined research question. Instead, it kind of emerged gradually out of lived experiences of displacement and out of a need to kind of make sense of those experiences, initially through storytelling and through cultural production and through literature and eventually through scholarship. And so I know I don't need to remind this audience of the kind of waves of migration, or the ways that we talk about migration flows, so to speak, from Iran in the 20th century. We have several scholars who have written extensively about those migrations and the ongoing migrations we see today. But of course, we have to highlight the fact that there have been migrations for a long time out of Iran. It's not a new phenomenon in that sense. What is perhaps more recent in terms of a phenomenon, if we were going to call it that, would be the large-scale emigration out of Iran in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, so sparked by revolution and war, right? And so Iranians arrived into Europe, North America, Australia, under very different circumstances. They may have similarly been required to leave Iran for reasons of rupture, right? But they didn't arrive in the same migration statuses with the same experiences or with the same goals in their new homes. And so some were political and religious asylees or refugees. Some were students who just never went back to Iran. Some were families seeking reunification and stability. So with that set of diversity already in place, the one thing they did share, right, was having left the same homeland under conditions of rupture, of war and revolution. And so in the 1980s, the kind of dominant framework for understanding those communities was not yet diaspora, but was of exile, right? So and indeed, the word diaspora itself is not reconceptualized in scholarship or in usage until the 1990s, so it wouldn't have been used that way anyway. However, when we think about exile, we think about loss, about separation, about the impossibility of a desired return and a focus on return. And so much of the 1980s and 90s writings among those in Iranian communities outside of Iran in that period, especially in literature, but also in memoir, and also in not only memoir as literature, but also scholarship about memoirs, focused on these kinds of themes, right? Of displacement, the pain of departure, the loss of a daily life, and the kind of political conditions that made return difficult or impossible. And so we can think of exile in academic context as an analytical framework, but we also need to remember that exile was an emotional and a political identity also for many people in that period. To be Iranian abroad in that period for many was also kind of positioned in relation to the revolution and to the state. And so cultural production also reflected that. We saw an orientation towards memory, towards mourning, and towards critique. One of the first kind of key works that we think of in the establishment of our field that we see now as kind of foundational to Iranian diaspora studies was, of course, Hemi Nefisi's The Making of Exile Cultures, Iranian Television in Los Angeles. That was published January 1st, 1993, to give you a sense of time. And the theoretical contributions of that book and the impact of that book far exceeded Iranian studies, Iranian diaspora studies, right? It was a kind of foundational text for a lot of fields, including media studies. But for the way we can kind of think about how we got from exile to diaspora, one way is to look at that text and kind of think about the ways that Iranians were orienting their cultural productions in the 1980s. But as communities became more established abroad, as new generations began to come of age who either were born outside of Iran or grew up outside of Iran with only partial memories of Iran, that language of exile no longer fully captured their experiences, right? So at the same time as poets and writers and scholars are rethinking the traditional use of the term diaspora in cultural studies outside of the Iranian context, they were using it to kind of reclaim the term to describe experiences and networks and identities of groups beyond a homeland. That doesn't erase loss and doesn't erase even a possible desire to return, but it doesn't center that and it doesn't limit us to loss. And so there's room in diaspora as it was reconceived and reconceptualized by scholars like Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy and others, especially thinking about the Black Atlantic and about African diaspora studies. There became room for thinking about growth and about multiplicity and about connection. So diaspora focuses especially on how people sustain relationships across borders, right? How identities are negotiated in new contexts, and how belonging is produced and potentially multiplied rather than simply replaced or lost. And so that shift from exile to diaspora as a kind of conceptual shift is also marking a transformation that Iranians were experiencing in their lives outside of Iran, coincidentally around the same time. And so, from thinking primarily about rupture and a desire to return to thinking about relationality, multiplicity, and the connections to where we're from, but also as what Paul Gilroy is called, where you're at, building communities both socially, culturally, and politically that transcend borders. And so Iranian scholars at the time of various disciplines in the diaspora were starting to kind of consider the applicability of that term used elsewhere to the Iranian case. And they were doing it quite early, actually. In the 1980s, I was able to find references by Hamid Dabashi, Annabelle Subreneri Mohammadi, Nasrin Rahimia, all prior to 1993. And Hamid Nafisi in that 1993 text was kind of debating between these two as well. And it kind of has that discussion there about how to think about the kinds of culture production that he was analyzing and the people that he was working with, right? And so he says, and I'll quote from him here, quote, "The difference that sets the exiles apart from people in diaspora," in quotes, "is that exiles' primary relationship is not so much with various compatriot communities outside the homeland as with the homeland itself," end quote. And that's precisely the kind of shifts that we see emerging in Iranian communities, especially in the 1990s, that kind of conceptual shift in the scholarship and shift in lived experience that started building diaspora organizations, that started to kind of create Persian language schools, that started to kind of think more about where we're at and who we're with across diaspora locations. So not only just like in relation to a host state, but rather to each other laterally, right? And so there's also a kind of generational shift that is tied to that conceptual shift and experiential shift, because it's not surprising that 1.5 or second generation Iranians have played a kind of crucial role in shaping this field, and their work especially kind of moves beyond narratives of loss to explore questions of identity and race and gender and cultural expression in complex ways. So as these conversations developed, Iranian diaspora studies starts to take shape as a recognizable field starting in the 2000s and 2010s. So one of the kind of key indicators of that transformation that we can look at, among others, is institutionalization. And there's pros and cons to institutionalization, but that is one way that we can kind of start to see the kind of gelling of a field or a subfield. So the field kind of begins to coalesce through conferences and workshops, right? So starting in 2003, a nonprofit organization based here in the United States that I was deeply involved with, called Iranian Alliances Across Borders, holds a biennial conference on the Iranian diaspora. It's intentionally international in scope. It's meant to kind of bring forward new scholarship to help us understand the connections across borders. And there were 5 of such conferences between 2003 and 2012. That were happening also alongside conferences and workshops by individual scholars like Persis Karim, who I mentioned, who herself was involved with or organized multiple conferences in the same period. So as we start to build those networks in the late 2000s and early 2010s, there is a clear thirst for this kind of scholarship, and junior scholars are looking for mentorship to kind of allow this research to happen. Several of us experienced along the way, well-meaning faculty advisors saying, like, you'll never get a job if you study the Iranian diaspora. Like, it's too niche. It doesn't relate to the Middle East broadly enough, or it doesn't relate to immigration broadly enough, or right. And so finding, scholars like Persis or Nima Naqibi, or I can name a number of very generous scholars who kind of like saw us flailing and pulled a hand out, right? And that is exactly what institutionalization can help to do, to build those networks and to create avenues for new scholarship, right? And so Persis Karim became the first director of the first Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, which has unfortunately been closed. We can talk about that in Q&A. That was at San Francisco State University. And the kind of creation of research centers, conferences, special issues like this one for Globus, and kind of collaborative networks dedicated specifically to Iranian diaspora studies have been really foundational spaces that have allowed scholars and artists and community members to kind of come together and articulate these shared questions, experiences, concerns, and research. And I think that's really significant because a field is not only defined by a topic. Like the Iranian diaspora is our field, and therefore it's our topic, therefore we have a field, right? It really is about the people who populate it and the questions and conversations that they engage in. And so you can only become a recognized field that has a robust scholarship, institutions, networks, when people begin to see themselves as participating in a common intellectual project and intellectual community, kind of nurtured and developed by scholars at every stage of their career. So we're working and have been working quite hard to try to forge that community of scholars that no longer have to kind of fight in isolated silos or at the margins of disciplines, and can kind of see themselves as contributing to this field. And we're really starting to see the impacts of that growth and those efforts, because the scope of this field has expanded quite considerably. And so early work on the Iranian diaspora really focused a lot on literature and cultural production, for good reason. There was fantastic work done in that area that kind of started us going, right? And so how Iranians told their own stories, how they're represented by others, how memory and identity are expressed through art and through writing remain foundational in this field. But with the growth of the field, we also can see an expansion, especially into the social sciences, which was the focus of this issue. And so researchers are now thinking about how Iranian diasporic communities shape and are shaped by legal systems, immigration policies, labor markets, global politics. And key books in the special issue that kind of broaden our view in those directions would be things like Manija Mouradian's This Flame Within, Catherine Summa's Axis of Hope, among others. There's also been an increasing attention to questions of racialization and racial identity, and how Iranians are positioned within different racial regimes in diaspora, right? So key books in that direction in the special issue are The Limits of Whiteness by Neda Maghbouleh, Conditional Belonging by Sahar Sadeghi, among others. And that expansion also kind of requires that we move beyond a kind of US focused perspective. So being an Iranian American scholar, my view is always going to have that kind of frame, and I can't change who I am. But what I can try to do is go beyond it, right? So for a long time, Iranian diaspora studies were kind of heavily concentrated in the US and in some ways in Western Europe. And so there's reason for that, right? If we think of Los Angeles, for example, where a lot of scholarship initially was looking at, especially in the social sciences, it makes sense if it's considered the largest Iranian community outside of Iran that we'd want to think about it and understand it. And I'll be the first to defend the importance of understanding Los Angeles and Iranians in LA. And I think we see recent scholarship show that that question remains open. That is not like a solved case, right? Farzaneh Hemasi's Tehrangeles Dreaming is featured in the special issue as one of the many ways that we can kind of think about Tehrangeles or Irangeles in different ways. But a global view of the diaspora is more urgent than ever. And this was something that was recognized early on when I was getting started as well. And comparative and transnational perspectives indeed will allow us to kind of see the experiences of diaspora communities around the world within a context of a global diaspora. And so we see scholars studying Iranian communities in Europe, in Canada, in Japan, and Korea, and Brazil, and on and on. And so they're asking different questions because they're in different national contexts, right? And we're thinking about relationships with states, we're thinking about policies, but we're also thinking about the global economy and the ways that migration is deeply tied with all of these forces. And so the kind of idea about thinking how national contexts, migration policies, and global politics are shaping the experiences of Iranian migrants is something that I also try to think about in my book, Cultural Beyond Country. So there I undertook a comparative ethnography of Iranian diaspora cultural production in the US, Sweden, and Canada. I spent 16 years thinking about this, including fieldwork between 2007 and 2023, and over 125 interviews conducted with cultural organizers, community members, and leaders in the diaspora in 3 countries. And so there I repeatedly heard from first-generation entrepreneurs and professionals outside of the arts industries that countering negative stereotypes and kind of taking the reins of representation had become a priority for them, and kind of really motivated moving into cultural organizing. And the Iranian immigrants from really diverse political, ethnic, and professional backgrounds across the diaspora that I met have worked to kind of do that through inserting their own cultural representations in mainstream publics, not only to evangelize about Iran and a homeland that they love, but also to specifically kind of correct what they view as a misrepresentation and therefore misrecognition that has resulted from and led to various forms of discrimination and negative effects in their diaspora homes. So while there are many ways to kind of fight those kinds of exclusions, stigmatizations, or misrecognitions in my study, diaspora Iranians in the 2010s specifically were repeatedly turning to culture as a strategy of inclusion in a multicultural society. And so the book looks specifically at Los Angeles, Toronto, and Stockholm as a study of Iranian diasporic cultural citizenship. How do we belong in these societies and become full members of societies respected and understood as Swedish, Canadian, American, alongside other identities. So across 5 chapters, I try to examine how those processes of representing Iranian culture in the diaspora generated not only competing views of Iranian culture and what it means to be Iranian, but also competing modes of belonging that variously subverted or reinforced existing power relations in these multicultural societies, but also beyond it and on transnational scales. And so the book examines how Iranian immigrants in these 3 locations mobilized cultural production. That's festivals and exhibitions, parades, public art, to kind of counter exclusion, shape public perception, and build new forms of belonging. And by tracing how Iranians have engaged with those multicultural policies in those societies alongside media representations and inter-community debates and often fragmentations around issues like authenticity, I show here how culture has served as a critical strategy for negotiating inclusion in those multicultural societies. Organizers often explained their choice to turn to culture because it wasn't seen as political work. And therefore, framing it as apolitical became a kind of safe way to frame a sense of belonging in a very tense geopolitical terrain. But these cultural projects are often deeply political, both in their efforts to reclaim representation, to resist misrecognition, to navigate these racial, social, and economic hierarchies of their societies, but also because they're also deeply motivated by a political future that they wanted for Iran, right? These are not disconnected from Iran, and they're not disconnected from hopes and dreams for Iran. So we can also kind of think about the ways that this cultural organizing of the 2010s has contributed to the diasporic movements we're now seeing much more explicitly politicized what they're doing in the 2020s. But let me return to the kind of focus of our session for the rest of my comments here. I want to kind of offer some important debates shaping the field today. So I want to address just a few of them here. There are many, and there are many directions that this can take. But one of the kind of concerns that the field has been looking at in recent years has been the relationship between diaspora studies and migration studies, which are kind of unfortunately been viewed as separate. And as Amjad kind of described for us in our field has also meant kind of bifurcations in terms of Persian scholarship and English scholarship or other languages. And so diaspora studies kind of often, this is very generalizing, and I apologize to my colleagues, often is kind of focused on questions of identity and culture and memory as they may relate to larger systems, but kind of forefronting some of those questions of belonging, right? While migration studies, and again, apologies to my migration studies colleagues who may disagree with this, Amjad, I expect you to correct me, but nevertheless, has tended to focus on mobilities and policies and governance and things of this nature. And so these are broad strokes generalizations, but increasingly, scholars in Iranian diaspora studies are working to bridge those approaches and to really understand how structural conditions shape and are shaped by individuals and Iranians' experiences are intersecting with those systems, right? Another kind of key debate that centers on representation and power is who gets to define what counts as Iranian identity, Iranian culture abroad, and which voices are amplified, which are marginalized. And those questions are particularly important in a context where media representations and political narratives are shaping public perceptions in very powerful ways in moments with very real geopolitical consequences. Right? There's also growing attention, I would say, to questions of gender and sexuality, new works that look at feminist and queer studies approaches to thinking about current fault lines and solidarities in the diaspora. One of the books kind of featured in the special issue is Rahul Rudsaz's recent Sexual Self-Fashioning, which is kind of dealing with some of those questions in a European context. I also see new work as being urgent in the area of digital and media studies and kind of the role of online spaces in shaping diasporic practices and identities. We've already kind of seen the publication of several article-length works in recent years and months relating to the women life freedom movement and the way that online behaviors and online discussions and discourses impacted that movement and how it was understood and how we could participate in it or not. So these kinds of developments are part of a broader trend towards greater interdisciplinarity, thinking more broadly about methodologies and about theoretical kind of contributions from a variety of different forms of scholarship, I would say, thinking through anthropology and sociology, media studies, queer studies, and beyond. But one of the distinctive features of Iranian diaspora studies is that a lot of the scholars of the field are themselves part of the diaspora. And that kind of creates a particular kind of relationship between researcher and subject, between research question and methodology as well. It can bring a depth of insight and commitment, I would argue. That's really important. But it also, of course, raises important questions about positionality, reflexivity, and how we understand our own place in the worlds that we study, which kind of brings me back to the reflection that I began with. We're not dispassionate about Iran, nor about Iranians or Iranian culture and history. And so, where does that kind of leave us today amid all of everything? I would say Iranian diaspora studies is, of course, still evolving. It is not a closed field. It never has been. And as more researchers in Iranian studies and elsewhere have found themselves kind of thinking about the diaspora, we kind of welcome more researchers and scholars to kind of join us with thinking about these questions. It's not a settled area of inquiry, and I expect it to grow in new and probably unanticipated directions as well. But kind of been reminded most explicitly in the last few months that the diaspora itself is also not homogenous, nor fixed, nor a settled entity or area of inquiry. There's a lot to explore here, and it's urgently needed. But I also just want to stress, and I think this issue does a good job of demonstrating, there's already good work to build on. Right. And so as new scholars kind of approach these questions, I encourage them to kind of read some of the foundational texts that I've highlighted here and among others, as well as recent scholarship that's really doing some really innovative work, especially given that we're in a context of ongoing migration and political developments and displacements. We're going to see a new set of questions emerging and a kind of changing dynamics of diasporic life. And so I hope that we can kind of work together to build an even stronger field and a greater sense of community to support the kind of work that needs to be done that's certainly not always easy to do. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. You basically, in a very short period of time, gave two separate lectures. I really enjoyed your ability to basically educate us on development of this scholarly community in the past few decades. I certainly learned quite a lot and will go and read some of the materials you suggested. You were also very generous in acknowledging other scholarly works. We often forget to do this. When I thought most of your talk would focus on your book, you did show us the special issue of Global Iranian Studies Review, but I see your in the shelf a copy of your book. I hope everybody goes. Just show that to us. I would like to encourage everyone to go and buy this book and read this. This was very thoughtful and very educational talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Professor Muqaddam, it's now your turn and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, Azam John, Dr. Khatam, Dr. Mirsepasi, for getting us involved in the special issue and for putting together this panel today at NYU. And thank you, Amy John, for this amazing, thoughtful history and story of Iranian diaspora studies in the field. Today, I will present two ongoing projects, I would say, that either focus on the Iranian diaspora in Toronto or it's somehow related to it because the second project is a little bit broader and I will explain later. So the first project is Toronto, Stories of Home and Belonging from Toronto Iranian Diaspora that I have the pleasure to co-lead with Nima Naghibi, who's a professor at the English department at Toronto Metropolitan University and supported by Social Sciences and Humanities Council in Canada. I will outline the scope of this project rather than present detailed results or any in-depth analysis as it's an ongoing project. The second project, Transnational Home Ownership Project, a comparative study of property ownership among middle-class migrants from the Global South, includes Iranian migrants. I started this project initially with Iranian migrants in Toronto and in Istanbul, and recently, since I moved back almost after 10 years to France, I expanded it to other groups, and we can talk about it later. Um, okay, next. Oh. Toronto Stories of Home and Belonging is an interdisciplinary project. Nima is trained in English studies and I'm a human geographer, so our methodologies are shaped by both the humanities and social sciences. The project examined the growth and influence of the Iranian community in Toronto from a transnational perspective and centers the life narratives of Iranian migrants in Toronto. With regard to this methodology, we adopt a mixed method approach that combines textual analysis, qualitative interviews, mapping technologies, and a central dimension of this project is the co-construction of knowledge with members of the Iranian community. Our aim has been and continues to be to create a space where members of the diaspora can share and exchange their personal stories. Concretely, we have organized a series of public readings based on short prompts that we circulated among members of the Iranian diaspora. In response, participants wrote short narratives, which they then presented during public events held at the university, and the images that you are seeing are part of those events. So these prompts were intentionally simple and accessible. For example, we invited participants to describe their first night in Toronto, and this led to a range of short life narratives reflecting on their life on their first night in Toronto or their early years as immigrants in the city. We did not intervene in these texts. Instead, participants presented their work in front of a diverse audience composed of both Iranians and non-Iranians. So community engagement is central to this methodology. The project is grounded in a decentered approach that prioritizes the voices and perspectives of diasporic Iranians. Rather than producing knowledge about the community through inaccessible academic forms, we seek to create a space in which their narratives are heard and placed at the center of the research. In the current political climate, and in the light of collective trauma affecting the Iranian community, we consider it essential to create a space that brings people together rather than emphasizing what divides them, divides us. This also means resisting the tendency to retreat into purely academic analysis, which at this stage may be premature given the evolving nature of events and their impact on political positions. In this context, we see the sharing of personal stories as a crucial first step. We also start from the premise that non-academic actors are capable of critical reflexivity about their own situations. They are not only participants, but contributors to knowledge production, which points towards the process of co-production of knowledge. This reflexivity enables an intersubjective form of knowledge production, but it also requires patience and a strong capacity for us to listen, especially given the diversity of social and political positions within the community. So co-producing knowledge can generate, of course, tension, political disagreements, and divergent perspective, but we see it as our responsibility to create a safe space within the academic setting where individuals can share their experiences as long as mutual respect is maintained. We approach this as both a scholarly responsibility, as a commitment as members of the Iranian diaspora in face of a collective trauma that affects the community across different political positions. This approach also raises important questions about our own positionality. And as Emijan has mentioned, these are key issues that are now raised in migration and diaspora studies. As members of the diaspora, we each have distinct trajectories and relationship to Toronto and to the Iranian community, given our own intersectional positionalities, which shape how we engage with this work. For instance, we systematically share our own migration stories with participants in order to foster a reciprocal and dialogical space. This involves a willingness to be vulnerable and to reflect openly on our own experiences. During the public readings, we contributed with our own narratives, so we try to place ourselves within the space of exposure as participants. In this sense, knowledge mobilization is not simply a performative academic exercise, but an ethical commitment that underpins and guides our work. So in addition to the work and the pictures that you are seeing, we have been collecting, interviews with migrants, and currently we are working with Toronto Metropolitan University and the Center for Digital Humanities to create an interactive platform where individual stories will be linked to different places. So it will be a map that we are hoping to have a prototype ready by the end of May. And the idea is that at some point this platform will be autonomous in the sense that other Iranians that we haven't interviewed will be able, through applications on their phones, to add their own stories linked to different places. So in the coming month, I'm flying back soon to Toronto. We will organize also urban and domestic tours with groups of Iranians to create this is another aspect of our project, to create what we call home city biographies that explore how migration histories, domestic lives, and urban spaces intersect in layered ways. So, just some words about the other project. It's the difficulty of, yeah. Up. So the other project, Emijan mentioned it, that often migration studies and diaspora studies have been separated. But I would say, now that I came back to France, I realized that again, that this is also very North American, to see that migration studies are, have been consolidated separately from diaspora studies. And in fact, now that I'm teaching a class, the title of my class is Diaspora and Transnationalism, which really, connects the two fields together. This project is sort of a different nature, I would say, situated at the intersection of urban and housing studies. It contributes to Iranian diaspora studies by exactly bridging migration studies with diaspora studies, and so more specifically with Iranian diaspora scholarship. The visualization that you see on the picture tries to kind of summarize the project to understand at the center the experience of home ownership and the way this experience is on one side influenced by policy frameworks, so immigration policies, housing and home ownership policies in different contexts, by intermediary actors such as immigration lawyers, real estate agents, exchange offices who intermediate these processes, and the transnational dimension in the sense of economic interdependencies or emotional interdependencies that individuals have with their countries of origin, and the way these relationships intervene in the process of becoming a homeowner. And as you can see, that this experience is also perceived by migrants themselves from different perspectives. Property as asset, as a form of belonging or integration, or as some sort of social protection, especially in context of eroding a welfare system. So this project conceptualizes the notion of transnational homeownership by forging connections at the intersection of migration, housing, homemaking, and diaspora studies. I started the first phase of the project in Toronto and to a lesser extent in Istanbul, focusing on Iranian migrants there. And gradually I decided, and we can talk about the evolution of that in the Q&A, to other groups of migrants coming from the global south. And the idea of having groups from Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Algeria, and Lebanon is the idea of insecurity, structural insecurity that has affected their countries of origin, which may turn the idea of ownership into some sort of response into structural insecurity, so as a way of protecting themselves. During this time, I've collected qualitative and quantitative data on immigrants' housing. Of course, in Istanbul, my research is more limited because of the context and availability of data. The notion of middle class as well is, of course, a problematic and contested category. But as a starting point, I draw on Briel and Racco's notion of the ordinary buyer to identify the kinds of migrants that buy property and for whom becoming homeowner means also going through considerable personal and financial sacrifice, typically as a way to preserve social status and ensure a sense of stability in the migration process. In the case of Iranian migrants, that is of interest today, the idea of middle class is obviously further complicated by the socio-historical trajectory of class in post-revolutionary Iran. Here, I examine the homeownership practices and imaginaries of Iranian immigrants and real estate professionals in Toronto to show how these practices are embedded in the dominant housing ideology of the Canadian settlement context, while simultaneously being shaped by ideas, practices, and conceptions of ownership inherited from migrants' prior experiences in Iran and within their diasporic spaces. A 2012 report published by the Canadian government on the housing conditions of immigrants, a new Canadian, explains that given that about 2/3 of households in Canada are homeowners, one of the expectations for those who integrate successfully into Canadian society is that over time, most immigrants will participate in the mainstream housing market by purchasing their own property. As such, for immigrants, as well as for those born in Canada, homeownership is integral to what is referred to as the Canadian dream or the perception of integration in many ways. And it's in many ways it's considered as some sort of rite de passage. Within this context, homeownership among immigrants in Canada has traditionally occurred from within a very short period of time, except in the post pandemic period, and this is commonly framed as a pathway to financial inclusion and as a mechanism intended to facilitate immigrant socioeconomic integration into Canadian society. Building on this data or understanding, I have analyzed the 2021 database that I obtained from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation on housing tenure among two migrant groups. Again, this is an ongoing project. The data, I've been processing it on South Asian and Iranian migrants across municipalities within the Toronto Census metropolitan area. This figure shows homeownership rates among Iranian and South Asian immigrants, so born outside Canada, are relatively high, around 52, 54.4, but slightly lower than the overall homeownership rate for Toronto population. What distinguishes Iranian households more clearly is their comparatively higher level of indebtedness. This pattern is illustrated in the accompanying map. This map that uses one indicator that is called shelter to income ratio, an indicator measuring the proportion of households' income devoted to housing costs, so primarily rent for tenants and mortgage payments for homeowners, and thus closely related to level of household debt. In this map, as you can see, circle size represent the size of Iranian population in each Toronto municipality, as well as the proportion of renters and homeowners within that population. So the spatial distribution reveals a strong overlap between areas with higher concentration of Iranian residents and elevated shelter to income ratio among Iranian immigrants homeowners, with the highest level observed in the Toronto core and adjacent municipalities with large Iranian population, commonly identified at Toronto, Tehranto, so for instance, Richmond Hill, Aurora, and Newmarket. And in fact, the level of indebtedness has increased since 2006 to 2021, so the last census. Traveling north from downtown Toronto, the first prominent markers of this Iranian presence are a large billboard advertising Iranian real estate agents, alongside those of immigration consultant and numerous Iranian currency exchange offices. One long-standing billboard that I think everyone in Toronto has seen before is the one that you see on the picture, where a real estate agent has been there forever. It says "Zamin bekharid ke zamin nakhorid," so literally buy land so you do not fall, drawing on the Persian idiom "zamin khordan." The message conveys the idea that property ownership functions as a form of protection against economic downfall. Through such messaging, real estate agents extend and reinforce a vision of property as security, an idea deeply rooted in Iranian imaginaries, but one that also resonates strongly with the Canadian ideal of homeownership as a form of welfare, social protection, and future-oriented asset accumulation. The omnipresence of Iranian real estate sector in Toronto urban space extends well beyond billboards. So, they are basically some sort of social persona. You find them everywhere in different social settings. As you can see on the pictures here. Mahsa, a 36-year-old Iranian woman who previously worked as a nurse before becoming a real estate agent within the Iranian community, here, emphasizes the normative dimension of homeownership among Iranians. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but then she's pointing to both the context in Canada, but also the instabilities in Iran that push Iranians to become homeowners without necessarily knowing the whole system. As discussed earlier, homeownership experiences are closely coupled with elevated levels of household debt. This configuration reflects dynamics well documented in housing studies, which show how the homeownership within financialized housing system simultaneously facilitate capital accumulation while generating heightened household indebtedness and financial risk. Sarah Akan's 43-year-old Iranian woman living in Toronto. She says, I'm going to read this and then it's the conclusion. As immigrants, we all want to buy property, and the Canadian government encourages everyone to do so. But in reality, they push you under the burden of debt and credit. The day you lose your job, you are finished. When we lost our jobs, we became indebted to friends and family. We owe over 100,000 to people around us. It's not written anywhere because we borrowed informally. Our credit lines are exploding and you keep paying more and more interest. That's when you ask yourself, was it really worth buying this house? After everything we went through in Iran, now we have to go through this again. So, as demonstrated in housing and home studies, the values and meaning individuals attach to decision to become homeowners obviously vary according to personal trajectories, which are themselves embedded in the historical, economic, and social path of societies in which they live. For the Iranian migrants that I examine here, these relations frequently unfold within a transnational socioeconomic space, which is also, shaped by diasporic community dynamics and the way individuals position themselves vis-a-vis the dominant norms and ideal of their society. So, in fact, what I try to show as well, just to conclude, is how this practices of home ownership creates new social hierarchies within the Iranian community, as financialized citizens or financialized diasporic persons. They become winners and losers based on when they entered the market in Toronto. And this is, again, a new way of creating hierarchies. And in fact, in my interviews, those who bought, of course, 10, 12 years ago, they were very happy about this experience. And those who arrived during the pandemic, they were the losers of the market. And these dynamics play an important role within the community, Iranian diasporic community in Toronto. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a very thoughtful and methodologically rich presentation. I appreciate this. Dr. Shaiste, is now your turn and floor is all yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Mr. Pasi. So, first of all, thank you very much for your kind introduction and for the opportunity. It has been a pleasure working with the journal over the past year, and I would definitely encourage everyone to visit its website, which features a wide range of work on Iran. So I would like to begin, sorry, I would like to begin by echoing what has been already said about the situation in Iran. It is a deeply devastating and painful situation. And I sincerely hope to see end to this ongoing war and better days ahead. So let me begin with a general observation, building on Amy and Amy John's point about the connection between migration studies and diaspora studies. I would like to approach Iranian studies, Iranian diaspora studies from somewhat different perspective. By looking at the body of research produced on the Iranian diaspora largely by scholars living outside of Iran, and comparing it with studies on Iranian migration studies conducted within Iran, it seems that we are witnessing a kind of disparity or even disconnection between the two. So the Iranian diaspora has been the subject of scholarly attention for years. More recently, this field has expanded significantly, partly due to the growing number of Iranian students in the social science who leave the country to pursue higher education abroad. Many of them, in turn, study the Iranian diaspora itself. At the same time, discussion about migration is no widespread in Iran, as many aspire to leave the country, from public spaces like taxes to official media, opposition outlets, social media, and family gathering. Migration is constantly discussed. This broader climate has also influenced academia within Iran, encouraging many scholars to study migration from within the country. The key point, however, is that while Iranian diaspora studies tend to focus on issues such as identity and culture, and to a lesser extent the socioeconomic characteristic of Iranian living abroad, migration studies produced within Iran are predominantly concerned with identifying and listing the reasons, like let's say push or pull factors that encourage or compel people to leave. At this point, the question is whether there is any meaningful relationship between these two streams of research. In other words, how can we think of connection or broader framework through which we can bring them together? To do so, it is important to understand migration not as a single moment, a physical movement, but as a process unfolding over time. From this perspective, migration often begins with an aspiration to leave the country. This idea may exist for years without necessarily leading to actual movement. At the same time, migration does not end with relocation. It continues after arrival and even after return. So, from the moment individuals begin to engage with the idea of migration, they become part of migration process. On the early, one of the earliest studies that has explored this dimension in depth is Arabistani's book on the desire to migrate in Iran, Tamannai Raftan, which has been reviewed in the journal. Arabistani shows how the desire for migration has become widespread in Iran and how it shapes the mindset of many Iranians. Importantly, this mindset is not only about intention to live, it is also tied to an imagined alternative way of life. I think this is a crucial issue that deserves further reflection. In my own research, which has also been reviewed in the journal and will be published as a book soon, hopefully, I began by examining this widespread desire to migrate and its consequences for different groups. Those who want to migrate, those who prefer to stay or cannot leave, those who do migrate, and those who return. My argument is that what is happening in Iran cannot be fully understood by listing push-pull factors. Rather, we are witnessing an environment in which migration is increasingly seen as the only viable path to a better life. It has become a taken for granted belief that migration is the only way to achieve what is often described as a normal life. This is what I refer to as the culture of migration. And I do not mean culture in a superficial like sense as a trend or illusion, but in its precise sociological meaning, a deeply rooted set of beliefs and values that shape behavior, often without being questioned. One example from my interviews may help clarify this point. When I ask a participant who intended to leave Iran about his friends and family's reaction, he said, "No one asked me why I want to migrate. They all ask how." To see, to see the contrast, consider someone who wants to move from Canada to the United States or vice versa. In that context, the first question is usually why. For example, whether there is a better job opportunity, but in the Iranian context, this why question often becomes irrelevant. Interestingly, the burden of answering the why question falls on those who want to migrate, who do not want to migrate. But sorry, falls on not on those who want to migrate, but on those who choose to stay or simply do not want to leave. Many interviews in this group reported that they hesitate to express their preference openly because they may be stigmatized by benefiting from the current situation or as a being stigmatized as being aligned with the Islamic regime in Iran. As a result, they often feel like they need to provide or elaborate justification for just the reason why they want to stay, or remain silent about their preferences altogether. At the same time, this widespread desire to migrate is not merely an abstract aspiration. For many, it becomes a long-term project. It can shape major life decisions, choosing field of study, careers that are in demand abroad, avoiding or delaying intimate relationships, postponing childbearing, and weakening social ties within Iran. These are all different consequences of living with this desire in mind. This prolonged orientation toward migration can reduce life satisfaction and affect mental health as well. My research also shows that the culture of migration has significant implications for political engagement of people living in Iran. All of this is happening in a context where migration is far from easy. Out of the millions of people who live with the desire to migrate, only a small proportion of them ultimately able to leave. Based on official international estimates, roughly 3% of Iran's population lives abroad, which is likely a very conservative figure. Some sources within Iran suggest that this number may be closer to 5% or slightly higher. At the same time, about 40% of the adult population in Iran expresses a desire to migrate permanently. My point here is to emphasize the gap between these numbers. Even if we take the higher estimate around 5%, or even like some people talking about 8%, whatever, while near the times it is like 8 times we are dealing with the 8 times more people who live with this desire inside Iran. So this widespread desire, as discussed earlier, has profound consequences for people's lives. This is what we refer to as involuntary immobility, a condition in which individuals seek migration but have little or no realistic chance of achieving it. It is surprising, by the way, that we still do not have a precise estimate of the Iranian diaspora, like the number. I would encourage you to take a look at the interview with Dr. Salavati, which is published in this issue. He was the head of Iran's Migration Observatory, Rasadkhane Muhajirat Iran, an institution that was later shut down by the government. The interview is about the story of the institute from its establishment to its eventual closure and the political challenges it faced. But anyway, up to this point, I have tried to show how we can move beyond conventional migration studies by focusing on social dimensions of migration, rather than simply listing economic or socio-political push and pull factors. However, this kind of knowledge about the environments people come from also helps us to better understand the characteristics of Iranian immigrants. Coming from such a context has important consequences for those who ultimately migrate. Just imagine how migration itself can be perceived as a major achievement when it is highly desired yet accessible only to a few. This strong pressure to migrate has led many individuals to leave Iran unprepared and with little or no concrete plan. Because opportunities to leave are rare and may arise only once in a lifetime, people often take them regardless of their level of readiness. The recent wave of Iranians arriving in Canada under temporary public policies provides a clear example of this dynamic. Many arrive without any clear understanding of how difficult it is to obtain permanent residency or secure a professional job here in Canada. And this is happening, but the point is due to Canada's restrictive visa policies toward Iranians, many of those who do make it here are relatively privileged. They often have like a strong socioeconomic background and high levels of education. Yet, despite all these advantages, many struggle to find even general employment for survival and face significant challenges in their settlement process. The point is, the migration has increasingly become a goal in itself, regardless of its quality. Um, um, Interviews with immigrants constantly show that many experience a form of shock after arrival. What they encounter often does not match their expectation, not only in terms of quality of life, but also in terms of fairness and absence of discrimination. What we are witnessing these days in part of Iranian diaspora, where some individuals show sympathy toward more radical or exclusionary political movements, can also be understood within this broader context, as at least part of this tendency may be rooted in the identity tensions or crisis that some migrants experience after arrival. To wrap up, I have tried to show how diaspora studies can be expanded by bringing them into closer dialogue with migration studies. Migration has two ends, and to better understand it, we need to consider both simultaneously. At the same time, one important dimension that requires much more attention and is often overlooked is the impact of diaspora behavior on the situation in Iran itself. The question is how the political engagement of the Iranian diaspora shapes developments in Iran, both at the micro level through transnational ties and at the macro level through advocacy, protests, and different forms of political positioning. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to take any question during
Thank you
Q&A.
so much.
Thanks.
Very interesting that our last presentation basically represents the migration studies and sort of connect with what was said by Amy early on. Thank you so much, all of you. Very thoughtful and very informative presentations for all of you. I see that there are some questions. There are two questions that are specifically addressed to Amin and Umid. Amin, John, if you see the question and you want to respond to this, go ahead. If you cannot see it, would be happy to read it for you.
I'm not sure I can
I
see.
think I said chat room, but I think you need to look at Q&A.
Yes. Mhm. Mm.
Or
I mean,
anyone who
I
want
can
to
send it
answer
to
any
you.
of.
I just sent it to you on the chat. I mean,
Okay, thank you, Leila Jam. I'm not very good at technology things, but
yeah, so on the data, yes, I think that
data on home ownership, yes.
yeah, the data on homeownership. So Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is um, funded by the government, but I would say that they extract their data from Canada Statistic Canada. So it's the official data on homeownership. And from my understanding, the data on the level of indebtedness is both from taxes, as you mentioned in your question, and there is another data on steers, so shelter to income ratio from also credit cards, but that is not concluded. It is included in the data provided by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I think it's quite objective as a data because it's part of it's extracted from a broader data that and the census that Canada Statistics they organize every 5 years.
Great, thank you. Any of our speakers want to respond to any of the questions, or do you want
Right?
us to read? Yeah,
Sorry. I was trying to let me.
sure.
Okay, we are asked to read the question. First of all, very interesting that you are studying a migratory body of students and foreign university. I'm curious if the political, ideological, but also cultural opinions and their evolution over influenced by the foreign culture and epistemic environments they embedded themselves in. Sorry, it is I'm struggling to see the question. Okay. Cultural epistemic environment they embedded themselves in has been studied or is being studied. Are there any preliminary conclusions that we can draw about the role of foreign universities acting at propaganda propagandistic, sorry, I can't pronounce this word correctly, propagandistic political forces toward the migratory younger academic Iranians? So, honestly, I, I, I don't know how to just address this question. It is, so what I'm trying to say, at least based on my understanding, it is not only about the propaganda. I'm not talking about the like just to some are trying to um I don't know to encourage people like um with false like pictures or image to just migrate to misuse them or whatever. It is not, at least some people may study it, some people may know. I'm not uh, I don't know. I have no idea about this question, how to address it. So it is not my idea is about. So definitely there is some benefits in leaving the country, and they can achieve something. But also, and there is many challenges inside Iran. So many people prefer to leave. So, and it becomes part of a culture, daily life in Iran, that people think about migration and they want to leave the country. But about the propaganda, definitely some people in media studies maybe can address it. And yeah, that's it.
Great. Any comments on the questions by any of the panelists?
I just want to add something about the data because sorry, I was just reading. I was trying to find a question, so I answered in the middle of my effort of finding the question.
Sure.
I just wanted to say that I think the data is objective in the sense that it's based on tax return in Canada, but the thing is that it's not the whole reality because there are many informal mechanisms, obviously, and that informal aspects of both home ownership, but in general households, and especially among Iranians, is not obviously reflected in the data that we see on the level of debt of households, because first of all, people can be they don't necessarily declare everything in their tax returns, and the other reason is also that the informal indebtedness that they can contract debt through their networks of family and friends, and this is another vulnerability that is no, I mean that is not reflected in the data. Thanks. It's not the whole picture. That's what.
Great. Any comments on any of other questions that are there?
Take a go at one of them.
Sure.
This one is from Roya Imani Iglu. I'm so sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly.
Sure.
The question was, you mentioned that cultural production is often framed as apolitical, but is actually deeply political. Do you think this framing limits the transformative potential of diaspora activism, or does it actually make it more effective in certain contexts? And this is a great question because this is part of the kind of question I'm seeking to think about myself. And so the organizations that I was looking at in this book and the kinds of projects of this book were in a 2010s context of seeking to build unity within communities that are deeply fragmented. And the kind of framing of an apolitical project is one that we saw not only in like the production of a festival or a parade, but also in like student organizations on university campuses, right? Or community organizations like language schools, where it's always framed as a non-political, non-religious, non-profit organization. This is a US context I'm speaking about right now. And so the kind of uh, use of that non-political or apolitical kind of framing was indeed, as you're describing, an attempt to bring together more members of a community that may have quite different political orientations, beliefs, hopes, etc. So in that context, uh, several of the organizations that I was looking at and the kind of projects I was looking at that was an effective strategy. More people were able to kind of volunteer or come together or attend those kinds of events and do some, I think, important community building work. But it was indeed at the moment of political engagement or the kinds of shifts in the political landscape of Iran and of its diaspora that position became problematic, right? And that led to some of the fragmentations we now see among those organizations or among those events. My chapter on Canada really kind of has to deal with that. With the focus in this chapter was on Tirgan, which is a big festival in Toronto that really built its reputation on this very specific focus on Iranian culture and arts, and very carefully excluded political commentary, flags, any kind of political representation at its events in order to bring a rather fragmented, large, diverse diaspora together in Toronto. But when a Canadian when a Ukrainian airline is shot down in Iran with over 150 Canadian Iranians on it, then what do you do? Do you still stay silent? Do you say that this wasn't a political situation? And how do you kind of reframe what you're doing in response to women life freedom and in response to demands by compatriots both in Toronto and in Canada and in Iran to do something? You've built this kind of network, this reputation, this kind of legitimacy on a cultural framing and an apolitical framing, but the demands require political action. And so it's that tension that that chapter kind of addresses a little bit, but it's a ongoing question, and especially as we see the ways that cultural organizations around the diaspora are trying to respond to political realities and challenges. This is an area for ongoing work for sure.
Okay. There is a question on the fact that during or after the 12 days war in June, journalists and many observers expected a huge number of people flow out of the country as refugees and immigrants. And the question says that reporters and others were moved to the borderlines to see this flow of refugees, but there wasn't really that much movements of Iran from Iran out to Turkey or other border areas. And the question asks if there is any thought you have on this. Why is it that if it is in fact Iranians are so ready and willing to leave the country, why in the aftermath of a war or even during the war, or maybe I know this to also be true, BBC had a report on border with Turkey, and they seemed to be surprised that there weren't too many people trying to leave the country. Omijan, do you want to respond to this, or any of you who have any
Of
thoughts on
course.
this?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a very good question, actually. And that's a very valid one, and we have to address it definitely. So I have I can answer it like I can think about it in different ways. So it is a still open question. We can just we need to do more research on it. But I can first of all, it is not easy for Iranians to leave the country. As I said, we are dealing with a situation which is involuntary mobility. For instance, it is not Ukraine. It is not like a open borders. Like there is no border with the Europe, and they are not like nobody will come to welcome Iranians who are leaving the country. And also, if you just think about the economic situation in Iran, it is not easy for people like to leave because so they mostly cannot afford like a few days out of Iran. So, but the more important point is not because some people may argue that so they can live as a refugee, and many, for instance, many left Syria as a refugee in very bad condition. So the more important point here is so part of what I call as a culture of migration in Iran, part of it comes with the idea with the optimistic outlook toward Western countries. So Western countries are like the place for democracy, for human rights, and whatever. So in this war, we see on one side is Iran, which is not popular, the government itself not popular inside Iran. But the other side is the US, which is the most like desirable destination for many Iranians as a base for human rights, democracy, and whatever. So I can explain it somehow that at least to this point, still many Iranians are very optimistic about that. So they don't believe that it's gonna be a catastrophe. So they are still struggling and they are still believing that this war will end soon and democracy will be in Iran soon. So this is about the this is about how they perceive, how they feel about the other end of the war, which is the US. And so they still expect to see salvation comes from abroad. So, but I guess this is not sustainable. If the war doesn't end soon, we will see waves of Iranians leaving the country in very bad, and I'm hoping that we don't get to that point.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond to my colleague's question, Aran Keshavarzian, or do you want me to read this? That's a different kind of question, but very relevant to what is going on now.
Yeah, I can read it and try to address it. It's
Sure.
a great question,
Thank you.
a challenging one indeed.
Sure.
So the question for those who can't see it is, thank you for a wonderful panel. Given your expertise, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the way the diaspora has been discussed in relation to the protests, brutal repression in January, and the current war. Specifically, do you see any specific problems with the discussion among academics, journalists, and experts these past few weeks? This is like the million-dollar
It
question.
can be topic of another panel.
Absolutely should be the topic of a full panel. The thing I think a lot of us who study the diaspora have been kind of conflicted about is that we see the diversity of a range of opinions that exist in the diaspora, but have had a difficult time conveying that, I think, to the media or to others asking us about it. I would say some journalists are very keen to show one side of the diaspora that happens to be the loudest. There is, of course, it is a big diaspora and it is a diverse diaspora built from a diverse country that itself has diverse political and religious and linguistic and ethnic kind of positions. And so I know I've had some journalists reach out to me asking questions, but I'm probably a journalist's worst nightmare because I refuse to give them the kind of soundbite that they want, the kind of like quick and easy. This is not a quick and easy, kind of topic. It's very challenging for those of us who even, have been paying attention for quite a long time to kind of wrap our heads around. And so much has shifted and changed in the last several years as well in terms of how the diaspora relates to one another, how they are engaging in certain dialogues or not, and closing off discourse among themselves. And so as members of that diaspora who are deeply kind of impacted by that, it can be very hard to then translate it quickly for a journalist. So I'm guilty of not being able to do that for journalists, to put it that way. And so I've kind of stepped aside and indeed leaving, unfortunately, some of our colleagues who are here, including John, to kind of like take that mantle for us in these interview kind of situations. But I do think that there are certain strands of opinion in the diaspora that have dominated media discourse And I mean that both in journalism and in our kind of social media kind of worlds. And the toxicity of our social media worlds has also kind of spilled into our everyday lives. And that kind of inability to engage in what one would imagine is democratic discourse, right? We need to be able to disagree with one another. We need to be able to kind of talk about difficult things without it turning into a situation where one side just completely wants to shut down and or has been kind of demonized or is threatened, which so many people are getting threatened these days over things that we should be able to talk about, that it becomes difficult to know how to represent such a difficult time and a difficult set of experiences. And that's not a very, I know, helpful answer here, but that's where I'm at. I wonder if my colleagues have other thoughts or ideas about it.
Sure, thank you. But as a follow-up to Arang's question, to make the issue a little more both specific and perhaps more complex, right? Before the war, in the aftermath of the protest and the killings that happened, Iranian Studies Association issued a statement, and basically, first, it seems that they convey the message that we are a scholarly community. There are some pressure on us to make a statement or perhaps condemn the killings of the protesters. That basically said this is not our part of our mandate. And then a couple of weeks later, they did actually issue a statement and condemn the killings. Any thought on that? Why is it the academic communities are so reluctant to genuinely make a statement on whether they should be involved in these kind of political situations or not? Because just reading Aaron question, this is really what came to my mind. First, basically issuing a statement and saying that we should not make a statement, and then basically making actually a very a strong political statement.
I think you have to ask the leaders of Iranian Studies Association why they did that.
Well, but you're a group of wonderful Iranian studies scholars, and
oh, we can have opinions about it, but they didn't ask us for our opinions. I mean, I think that's the action.
Yes.
My reaction is that nobody asked us what we think. Nobody said, hey, membership, should we weigh in here? And so they took a decision. So they have to be responsible for having made that decision. I will say that outside of that particular association, there have been a lot of Iranian academics who have been writing petitions, signing petitions, circulating, statements of folks in Iran, right? So trying to amplify the voices within Iran, not only within its diaspora.
But that's mostly against the war. On the
I've seen them on
killings and protests, many scholarly communities have preferred to stay silent. I think Arang has a point there. But any thoughts on since it doesn't seem that we have any other questions.
I just want to add
discussion, but we have a little time if you want to reflect on each other's talk points or anything so that we conclude our panel.
Yes, go ahead. Yes. I think Amy mentioned very well in her presentation that diaspora as a research topic creates this situation where we have it as a research topic, but it's also our positionality as diasporic subjects and our relationship to our topic. So if we consider diaspora and Iranian diaspora as a research topic, we have the right to follow the temporality of research and be silent sometimes, because understanding a situation takes time and temporality matters, and we should not be pushed and obliged to say anything about something that we consider as a research topic. Amy has been working on her project for the past 16 years, and now she's presenting her work. And same thing for all of us. So I think that's one thing. The other aspect, it's the positionality and the fact that we are affected as the member of this diaspora being in France or in the US. And so I think that what we will trying to do with Nima Nagibi is to say, instead of saying you're right or you're wrong, creating a space as much as we can so that people they can talk about their stories. And again, I go back to this point that we believe that rather than thinking about their political affiliation of or polarization of the Iranian diaspora, maybe the starting point could be individual stories. And maybe if we start with individual stories, personal stories, again, we will be able to create a collective space. So that's it. And then but the question that part a little bit to the question that Orang John asked is, I think same thing. I mean, in France, obviously at this moment, we have many journalists reaching out to us and trying to get, and they write, they have a different job and they also have a different temporality in their job. And the way they see realities, they go to Paris and they see a group of people with new signs and symbols they haven't seen before. And of course, it's a great way of talking about the Iranian diaspora, and they have to write that for tomorrow. I think we should have the right to be sometimes silent and not necessarily participate to their effort of showing certain image of the Iranian diaspora until we have the freedom of saying we can talk at this point or we don't actually. Thank you.
Well, that's political too. Staying silent or speaking your mind are both political. They're okay, and people can either stay silent or make a statement. But yes, these are all politics within diasporic communities.
Elijah, may I ask a question?
Ask question? Sure, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, this journal was closed, I believe, 6 months ago. So we have seen a lot in the diasporic experiences that we have in different places in political terms. And I want to ask my friends and colleagues, did you expect such, shift to political engagement with Iran in different diasporic situation that you were working in? For example, Amin was in Toronto, and Toronto has become a spotlight of this political mobilization around the war. This shift from the host communities, which migrant and diaspora was engaged and try to integrate in it, to the home, community, to Iran, and trying to change the political situation there through demonstration, the change of regime, everything that they have in mind. Was it expected? Was it part of the questions that you dealt with before the war, or it is something new that I can't, track down because I am not an expert in this field?
Although you live in Toronto too. I think you are asking the panelists, right? Okay.
I'll take a first answer, but I'd love to actually hear what Omi and Amin have to say about it. I think for me, it was always part of the equation. I mean, for a lot of the interlocutors that I was speaking to, like I said, some of my interlocutors in Sweden, for example, like their whole reason for organizing what was a cultural event was a reaction to politics in Iran, right? It was after Charshan Basri was being repressed in Iran, and it was after 2009 and the Green Movement and repression in that, and they wanted to kind of answer back in a way. So it was never separate from Iran and a future kind of hope for change in Iran. I think that it's been actually more common in our communities to have that homeward orientation politically than political engagement in our new societies. We don't see as much, let's say, civic action towards American politics in our communities as we do the kind of political concerns towards Iran. And when we do, it's about the foreign policy towards Iran. So I think there's always been that kind of like sense of concern and also activism with regard to Iran rather than to like the host country, as you put it.
Okay, thank you. Aminja?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emmy. The only thing I could add is this, because the work I've done in the Gulf as well, in Dubai, and then later in Canada, I mean, my entry point has been often this kind of economic interdependence that connects Iranian diaspora to Iran. So here is through home ownership. And at the time when I work on Dubai and with Southern Iran was through philanthropic and also, the circulation of money between the two shores of the Gulf. And I think what is interesting is how this kind of economic interdependencies also may shape the way people they define their political engagement with the countries of origin. I mean, in the sense that sometimes it becomes a little bit more nuanced in the way they want to get engaged because they still depend a lot on the situation in Iran, and that state in Iran has a very broad definition, like in many other places, but it has many, heads and figures and hands of the Iranian states that go quite far. So I think that would be interesting to see also how this kind of economic interdependencies may de facto shape the type of transnational connections or political connection that they may have with Iran and their political engagement vis-a-vis Iran.
Great. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel and very thoughtful presentations. Thank you. Thank you. Our thanks to our panelists and also for all of you who joined us. And I very much hope that I see you for our next event on April 10th. Have a good day, everyone, and hopefully we will have peace very soon in Iran. Great.
Thank you, Dr. Mirsapasi. Thank you.
Sure, Azam Jan. And this ends our event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.